Welcome to UPSC IMP. The Crown Rule 1858 into 1947. Government of the Indian Act of 1858. This significant act was enacted in the wake of the revolt of 1857, also known as the First War of the Independence or the Sepoy Mutiny. The act, known as the Act for the Good Government of India, abolished the East India Company and transferred the power of the government territories and revenues to the British Crown. Features of the Act. It provided that the Indian henceforth was to be governed by and in the name of Her Majesty changed the design of the Governor General of India to that of Viceroy of India. Viceroy was the direct representative of the British Crown in India. Lord Canning thus became the first Viceroy of the India. Lord Canning thus became the first Viceroy of India. It ended the system of the double government by abolishing the Board of Control and Code of Directors. It created a new office, Secretary of the State for India, vested with the complete authority and control over the Indian administration. The Secretary of the State was a member of the British Cabinet and was ultimately responsible to the British Parliament. It established a 50-member Council of India. To assist the Secretary of the State for India, the Council was an advisory body. The Secretary of the State was made the Chairman of the Council. It constituted the Secretary of the State in counselling as the body corporate capable of suing and being sued in India and in England. The Act of 1858 was, however, largely confined to the improvement of the administrative machineries by which the Indian government was to be supervised and controlled in England. It did not alter in any substantial way the substance of the government that prevailed in India. Indian Council Act of 1861, 1892 and 1909. After the Great Revolt of 1857, the British government felt the necessity of seeking the cooperation of the Indian in the administration of their country. In pursuance of this policy of association, 3 acts were enacted by the British Parliament in 1861, 1892 and 1909. The Indian Council Act of 1861 is an important landmark in the constitutional and policy history of India. Features of the Act of 1861. It made the beginning of the representative institutions by associating Indians with the lawmaking process. It thus provided that the Viceroy should nominate some Indians as a non-official member of his expanded council. In 1862, Lord Canning, then the Viceroy, nominated 3 Indians of his legislative council. First, Raja of Banaras, second, Maharaja of Patiala, and third, Sirdinkar Rao. First कौन है? The Raja of Banaras, second, Maharaja of Patiala, and third, Sirdinkar Rao. It initiated the process of the decentralization by restoring the legislative powers to the Bombay and Madras presidency. It thus reversed the centralizing tendency that started from the Regulating Act of 1773 and reached its climax under the Charter Act of 1833. This policy of legislative evolution resulted in the grant of almost complete internal autonomy to the provinces in 1937. It also provided for the establishment of the new legislative council for Bengal, northwestern provinces, Punjab, which were established in 1862, 1886 and 1897 respectively. It empowered the Viceroy to make the rules and orders for their more convenient transaction of the business in the council. It also gave the recognition to the portfolio system introduced by Lord Canning in 1859. Under this portfolio system, Lord Canning, 1859. Under this, the member of the Viceroy Council was made in charge of the one or more department of the government and was authorized to issue a final order on behalf of the council on matters of his departments. It empowered the viceroy to issue ordinance without the concurrence of the legislative council during an emergency. The life of such an ordinance was 6 months. Features of the Act of 1892. It increased the number of additional non-official members in the central and provincial legislative council, but they maintained the official majority in them. Increased the function of the legislative council and gave them power of discuss the budget and addressing the question to innate executive. It provided for the nomination of the some non-official member of the Central Legislative Council by the Viceroy on the recommendation of the Provincial Legislative Council and the Bengal Chambers of the Commerce, and that of the Provincial Legislative Council by the Governor on the recommendation of the district boards, municipalities, universities, trade associations, zamindars and chambers. The Act made a limited and indirect provisions for the use of the election in the filing of some of the non-official seats both in the central and provincial legislative council. The word election was, however, not used in the Act. The process was described as a nomination made on the recommendation of the certain bodies. Features of the Act of 1909. This act is also known as the Morley-Minto reforms. Lord Morley was then Secretary of the State for India and Lord Minto was then Viceroy of the India. It considerably increased the size of the Legislative Council in both the central and provincial. The number of the members in the Central Legislative Council was rise from 16 to 60. The number of the member in the Provincial Legislative Council was not uniform. It retained the official majority in the Central Legislative Council but allowed the Provincial Legislative Council to have non-official majority. It enlarged the deliberative function of the Legislative Council at both the levels. For example, members were allowed to ask supplementary questions, move resolution on the budget, and so on. It provided for the first time for the association of the Indians with the Executive Council of the Viceroy and the Governor. Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first India to join Viceroy Executive Council. He was appointed as the law member. Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy Executive Council. He was appointed as the law member. It introduced the system of the communal representation for the Muslim by accepting the concept of the separate electorates. Under this, the Muslim members were to be elected only by the Muslim voters. Thus, the Act legalized communalisms, and Lord Minto came to be known as the father of the communal electorates. Lord Minto became to be known as the father of the communal electorate. It also provided for the separate representation of the presidency, corporations, chambers of the commerce, universities and zamindars. Government of the Indian Act of 1990. On August 20, 1970, the British government declared for the first time that its objective was a gradual introduction of the responsible government in India. The Government of India Act of 1990 was thus enacted, which came into force in 1921. This act, also known as the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms. Montagu was the Secretary of the State for India and Lord Chelmsford was the Viceroy of India. Features of the Act of 1990. It relaxed the central control over the provinces by democrating and separating the central and provincial subject. The central and provincial legislature were authorized to make laws on their respective list of the subject. However, the structure of the government continued to be centralized and unitary. It further divided the provincial subject into the two parts, transfer and reserves. The transfer subject were to be administered by the governor with the aid of the minister responsible to the legislative council. The reserve subject, on the other hand, were to be administered by the governor and his executive council without being responsible to the legislative council. This dual scheme of the governance was known as diarche, a term derived from the Greek word diarche, which means double rule. However, this experiment was largely unsuccessful. It introduced for the first time bicameralism and direct election in the country. Thus, the Indian Legislative Council was replaced by the bicameral legislatures, consisting of an upper house council of the state and a lower house legislative assembly. The majority of the members of both the houses were chosen by direct election. It required that the three of the six members of the Viceroy Executive Council, other than the Commander-in-Chiefs, were to be an Indian. It extended the principle of the communal representation by providing separate electorate for Sikhs, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians and Europeans. It extended the principle of the communal representation by providing a separate electorate for Sikh, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians and Europeans. It granted a franchise to limited number of people on the basis of the property tax or education. It granted franchises to limited number of the people on the basis of the property tax or education. It created a new office of the High Commissioner for the Indian in London and transferred him to some of the functions to perform by the Secretary of the State for India. It provided for the establishment of the Public Service Commission. Hence, Central Public Service Commission was set up in 1926 for recruiting a civil servant. Central Public Service Commission was set up in 1926 for the recruiting civil service. It separated for the first time provincial budget from the central budget and authorized the provincial legislature to enact their budget. It provided for the appointment of the statutory commission to inquire into report on its working after the 10 years of its coming into force. Simon Commission. In November 1927 itself, 2 years before, 2 years before the schedule, the British government announced the appointment of the 7-member statutory commission under the chairmanship for Sir John Simon to report on the condition of the Indian under its new constitution. All the members of the commission were British and hence all the parties boycotted the commissions. The commission submitted its reports in 1930 and recommended the abolition of the diarchy, extension of the responsible government in the provinces, establishment of the Federation British India and the princely stated continuation of the communal electorate and so on. To consider the proposal of the commission, the British government convened the 3 roundtable conference of the representation of the British government, the British India and the Indian princely state. On the basis of this discussion, a white paper on the constitutional reforms was prepared and submitted for the consideration of the joint selected committee of the British Parliament. The recommendation of this committee were incorporated with the certain changes in the next Government of the Indian Act of 1935. Communal Award. In August 1932, Ramsay MacDonald, the British Prime Minister, announced a scheme for representation of the minorities, which came to be known as a Communal Award. The award not only continued a separate electorate for the Muslim, Sikh, Indian Christian, Anglo-Indians and European, but also extended it to depressed classes, scheduled caste. Gandhiji was distressed over this extension of the principle of the communal representation to the depressed classes and undertook fast unto the death in the Yeroda jail, Pune, to get the award modified. At last, there was an agreement between the leaders of the Congress and the depressed classes. The agreement, known Pune Pact, retained the Hindu joint electorate and gave reserved seats to the depressed class. Government of the Indian Act of 1935. The Act marked the second milestone toward the complete responsible government in India. It was a lengthy and detailed document having 321 sections and 10 schedules. Features of the Act of 1935. It provided for the establishment of an all India federation consisting of the provinces and princely state as a unit. The act divided the power between the center and the unit in terms of the three lists of federal list, center with 59 items, provincial list, provinces with 54 items, and the concurrent list for both with 36 items. Residual powers were given to the viceroy. However, the federation never came into being as the princely state did not join it. It abolished hierarchy in the provinces and introduced provincial autonomy in its place. The provinces were allowed to act as an autonomous unit of the administration in their defined spheres. Moreover, the act introduced the responsible government in the provinces. That is, the governor was required to act with the advice of the minister responsible to the provincial legislature. This came into effect in the 1937 and was discontinued in 1939. It provided for the adaptation of diarchy at the center. Consequently, the federal subjects were divided into reserve subject and transferred subject. However, this provision of the act did not come into operation at all, and introduced a bicameralism in 6 out of 11 provinces. Thus, the legislature of the Bengal, Bombay, Madras, Bihar, Assam, and the United Provinces were made bicameral, consisting of the Legislative Council, Upper House, and Legislative Assembly, Lower Houses. However, many restrictions were placed on them, and it introduced the bicameralism in 6 out of 11 provinces. The legislature of the Bengal, Bombay, Madras, Bihar, Assam, United Provinces were made bicameralism, consisting of the Legislative Council in Upper House and Legislative Assembly, Lower House. However, many restrictions were placed on them. It further extended the principle of the communal representation by the providing separate electorates for depressed classes, scheduled castes, women, and laborers. Separate electorates for depressed class, scheduled caste, women, and labor work. It abolished the Counciling of India established by the Government of the Indian Act 1858. The Secretary of the State for India was provided with the teams of the advisor. It extended the franchise. About 10% of the total population got the voting rights. It provided for the establishment of Reserve Bank of India to control the currency and credit of the country. It provided for the establishment of not only a Federal Public Service Commission but also on a Provincial Public Service Commission and Joint Public Service Commission for 2 or more provinces. It provided for the establishment of Federal Code, which was set up in 1937. Indian Independence Act of 1947. On February 20, 1947, the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee declared that the British rule in India would end by June 13, 1948, after which the power would be transferred to responsible Indian hands. This announcement was followed by the agitation by the Muslim League demanding the partition of the country. Again, on June 3, 1947, the British government made it clear that any constitution framed by the Constitutional Assembly of India formed in 1947 cannot apply to those parts of the country which were unwilling to accept it. On the same day, June 3, 1947, Lord Mountbatten, the Viceroy of India, put forth the partition plan known as the Mountbatten Plan. The plan was accepted by the Congress and the Muslim League. The immediate effect was given to the plan by enacting the Indian Independence Act 1947. Features of the Act of 1947. It ended the British rule in India and declared features of the Act India as an independent and sovereign state from August 15, 1947. It provided for the partition of India and creation of 2 independent dominions of India created and Pakistan with the right to succeed from the British Commonwealth. It abolished the office of the Viceroy and provided for each dominant Governor General, who was to be appointed by the British King on the advice of the dominant cabinet. His Majesty's government in Britain was to have a responsible with respect to the government of India or Pakistan. It empowered the Constitutional Assembly of the two dominants to frame and adopt any constitution for their respective nations and to repeal any act of the British Parliament, including the Independence Act itself. It empowered the Constitutional Assembly of both the dominants to legislate for their respective territories till the new constitution were drafted and enforced. No act of the British Parliament passed after the August 1947 was to be extended to either of the new dominants unless it was extended thereto by law of legislature of the dominants. It abolished the office of the Secretary of the State for India and transferred its function to the Secretary of the State for Commonwealth Affairs. It proclaimed the lapse of the British paramountcy over the Indian princely state and treaty relation with the tribal areas from August 15, 1947. It granted freedom to the Indian princely state either to join the Dominion of India or Dominion of Pakistan or to remain independent. It provided for the government of each of the dominions and the provinces by the government of the Indian Act 1935 till the new constitution were framed. Dominions were, however, authorized to make the modification in the act. It deprived the British monarchy of this right to veto bills or ask for reservation of certain bills for this approval, but this right was reserved for the Governor General. The Governor General would have full power to assent to any bill in the name of His Majesty. It designated the Governor General of India and the provincial governor as a constitutional nominal heads of the state. They were made to act on the advice of the respective council of ministers in all matters. It dropped the title of the Empire of India from the royal titles of the King of England. It discontinued the appointment to civil service and reservation of the post by the Secretary of the State for India. The member of the civil service appointment before August 15, 1947 would be continued to be enjoy all the benefits that they were entitled to till that time. At the stroke of midnight 15 August 1947, the British rule came to an end and power was transferred to the two new independent dominions of the India and Pakistan. Lord Mountbatten became the first Governor General of the new dominion of India. He swore in Jawaharlal Nehru as the first Prime Minister of independent India. The Constituent Assembly of India formed in 1947 became the Parliament of the Indian Dominion. Thank you.